Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, maybe after the lunch break for some of you. The next session is called Tales of the City. Armistead Maupin and is in conversation with Siddharth Dhanvant Shanghvi.
Well done.
And we are really glad to have you here and looking forward to a really interesting conversation. Thanks. Oh yes, the session is sponsored by DNA. I almost forgot.
Armistead, welcome to Jaipur, to India. I have a funny story to start with about the impact of your book, because I'm sure you've heard a million stories. So I was a student in America at the age of 22 when I came in, and into my third day, I decided to leave. So my mother said, why? And I said, oh, you know, they have communal bathing in this country. And the idea of being naked around a bunch of strangers wasn't all that appealing at the time. I have since recovered, but so then I went back to my roommate and I said, you know, I'm going back, you know, this is not working out. And my roommate said, just relax, you don't know how the Bay Area works, read Tales of the City. And I did that, and I fell into the book, and it was like a love affair. And I stayed on for 6 years. So one of the most important reasons for why I spent so much of time in California was because of your work, so I thank you for that.
I thank you for telling me that. I loved that place. I mean, I came there from a very repressive culture in North Carolina. And so when I arrived in this city where everyone was comfortable, where the straight people were more comfortable with my sexuality than I was. And it made me feel instantly at home. Mm-hmm. And I loved the variety of mankind. I mean, there was no racial diversity where I came from. So all of that fed my work in a big way.
Well, one of the extraordinary things about Tales of the City is how dearly beloved the books are. You know, people love them like I love them. But I also love the form of them. So you want to talk to us a little about how they came into existence, the specificity of the form?
Well, the whole thing began when I was trying to write a story, a nonfiction story for a little local newspaper about the heterosexual cruising scene at the local supermarket.
Oh, you need to elaborate on this one.
Yeah. Wednesday nights, every Wednesday night, a girlfriend of mine said, you've got to go down to the Marina Safeway on Wednesday night and see this. People came and loitered around the vegetable department at the supermarket to pick each other up. It was the equivalent of going to a bar. If you didn't want to go to a bar, you could go to the Marina Safeway. And so I went there and tried to write a story about it, but of course I couldn't find anyone that would admit that that's why they were at the supermarket. So I made up a new girl in town. I named her Marianne Singleton. Her name actually is Singletown, and the word singleton also means you know, a one-of-a-kind person. Actually, that term was used by, in the Bridget Jones. She borrowed that from, she told me, the author told me she got that from Tales of the City. But anyway, I made up Marianne Singleton, and the editors of this little newspaper said, why don't you follow her every week? And then it drew the attention of the big newspaper in town, the Chronicle, and they said, we'd like you to do it 5 days a week. Panic struck my heart because I realized I was going to have to write 800 words a day, no matter what. But I was lucky because I was the new girl in town in many ways, and everything that came into my own experience I could use in one way or another. And so I wrote it in those segments over many years, a number of years anyway. And I've just finished the 9th volume.
Wow.
After 40 years. And I had to create, the challenge of this, of course, was to create things that were individually readable, a daily episode that people could read over their breakfast in the morning.
Dickensian.
Well, there was that tradition of serial fiction from the 19th century, Dickens and Thackeray, and Wilkie Collins' famous motto was, make them cry, make them laugh, and make them wait. So that was always my concern, that I bring people back for more. And I had to do that over the novels, and then those 9 novels had to fit together in a shape. Yeah,
Work,
so it was,
and they do.
and they do.
You know what I also find so beautiful is the fact that these were books
You're gonna have
that
to-
started out really on whim. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Don't make me make that gesture.
Well, Stephen Fry was doing that at the session.
doing
He had-
about-
No, he had a mic that was drooping, so he looked at me. He said, "Everything droops around me." So, sorry. One of the things that I wanted very much to acknowledge about the books was that because they're so engaging, they're so entertaining, it's very easy to forget how serious they are. And we spoke about this on email maybe a month ago about a novel being a mirror walking down the street, which is also something that Michael Ondaatje talks about. And that's what these books turned out. They were mirroring society in transition. They were talking about the way people were living their sexual lives, their emotional existences, and there you were watching all of this.
I made up my mind very, very early on that I would tell the truth about whatever was happening around me in my own way with humor. And naturally when AIDS came along, and several of my friends were instantly struck down, I had to make a decision about how I would incorporate this terrible enormity into something that was basically a comedic work. And I received criticism at the time, where there were people, the writer Edmund White said there should be no humor involved in the handling of the AIDS epidemic. And every person I knew that was suffering under this was rescued by humor. Humor is our great support in a terrible time. So I built it in. I killed off one of the major characters, much the way Dickens did with Little Nell, and made Dr. John Fielding, who dies off screen in Baby Cakes, was the first AIDS fatality in fiction anywhere. And I was able to do it before the whole population of a city and make them feel it personally, which is what I wanted. I wanted them to feel what I was feeling about the friend that I had lost. Everything else, as life changed, I could incorporate all sorts of things. I'm really proud of the fact that I was writing about lesbian mothers 25 years ago. Mrs. Madrigal, the landlady at 28 Barbary Lane, who's rather mysterious at the beginning, is the first, generally acknowledged as the first sympathetic transgender character in fiction.
And also talented roller of joints, right?
And she's, yes, first unapologetic pot smoker landlady.
That is important.
There's a lot of autobiography in Tales of the City, and I just tried to bring my own joy to it, what I was feeling, the freedom I felt in this new town, and the discovery that the thing that I had feared the most about myself as a boy, the fact that I was gay, and that my mother feared the most about when she found out I was gay, oh, you must keep it secret, you must not tell your father. Oh, just before she died, she said, I just don't want it to ruin your career. And I said, you don't understand, it is my career. And the thing that I had feared the most became the greatest source of joy for me and the source of my success. If I had not done that, I would not be sitting here in Jaipur right now in a room full of people that I, with a few exceptions, have never met. It's thrilling to know that that's what the truth did for me.
Well, when you were talking a little about the AIDS epidemic and the influence of that, I was reminded of another common friend that we have, John Berendt, who wrote Midnight in the Garden.
I know
of
John,
Eden,
yes.
Yeah. And you know how that book came along was his response to the AIDS epidemic was to retract. So he went out to a small town, wrote about it, and that's how the book came into existence. So many different people respond, many different writers respond very differently.
Did Berendt acknowledge that was his retreat from it?
No, a lot of his friends were dying. So I
Yeah.
think he went into panic, and he was at the time the editor of New York Magazine, and the position went bust. So there was no job and many people around him who were sick. So he just basically cut tail and went off to Savannah and had no idea that he was going to write a book. He stayed there for 7 years. And when the book came out, it was published, it was 1,500 copies, and they had no idea they would go and spend, kind of like your books, 4.5 years on the New York Times bestseller.
Yes, and it still sells in the souvenir shops in Savannah, you know.
Well, as your book sells
As
in San
mine do,
Francisco.
too.
I mean, you're basically like a walking monument, right? Like people go up and ask for your photograph even more than they do in Jaipur.
Well, well, I think it's a great privilege to have your work associated with the city. You know, to be considered a kind of voice or a represent, not a voice, because what I have to say is I'm just saying for myself, but to be associated with a great city is wonderful. And it's helpful when people come to that city because I don't know about anybody else, but I love, you know, before you go to a city to read some piece of fiction about it so that you feel like you're in the landscape. When I was a little boy, I had just read Gone with the Wind, and my parents took me to Atlanta, and I said, I know it's fictional, but where would Tara be if it were here, you know?
So you're always inhabiting that. What do you believe has been the most profound impact of your work, you know, even within the village life of Castro or San Francisco? What's been something that's been transformative that you've seen?
About my own work?
And its impact on your readers and people.
Well, I mean, the thing that I hear most often that is that, I mean, people say, I know many writers hear this, so I'm not, but they will say your book saved their life. And by that they mean that you have helped them to find themselves in some way. For me, that's a lot of LGBT people say that. But I also hear from plenty of straight readers who, in some way or another, freed themselves from the past, from an unhappy situation, and found their way into what I call a logical family. Mrs. Madrigal, the landlady in Tales of the City, says it at several points in the last couple of novels. You have your biological family, and then you have your logical family. Sometimes if you're lucky, sometimes members of your biological family can also be members of your logical family.
Dual passport.
They don't, what?
Dual passport.
Dual passport, yes. But not always. I have a brother who's 5 years younger than I am, who's a diehard Republican who supports candidates who don't support me. And he sees no disparity there. He thinks he can love me and still take that stand. It doesn't feel like love to me. It would interest you to know that he came out to, well, I should back up a little bit. We have a mutual friend in the writer Amy Tan. Lovely person.
And I know Armistead because of Amy.
And we know each other because of Amy. Alexander McCall Smith and I know each other because of Amy. Amy is the link to the world.
Resident goddess.
But my husband Christopher and I were married in Amy's garden. She was generous enough to let us have her garden for our wedding ceremony. Why am I telling you this?
It's about your brother. You were backing up.
Thank you. My brother came to the wedding, and we had these lovely cocktails that we had several things we wanted to do in our wedding. We'd been to a lot of weddings, including some gay weddings that just bored us to tears. So we decided on a really short ceremony, and that everybody would have a cocktail the minute they came in the door so they could relax. And we had this beautiful garden in the sunshine. And my brother grabbed about 4 of those cocktails because his brother was getting married to a man and he could barely handle it, you know. He was trying to be a good sport. And after he got a little high, he wandered around and he came up to 2 women friends of ours and said, "Y'all are mighty pretty for lesbians." Oddly enough, our friends were delighted. I thought it was the nicest thing he could have said, you know.
You know, if you can take a moment and just segue into a little about the themes that have dominated your work, and or at least the themes that I perceive, because most people only just, sorry, well, hey. Is loneliness, for instance, that's really at the center of so much of the work that you do. And it's also something that's accompanied your own life. You want to help me unpack a little bit about that?
It's interesting. You've said this to me several times now, and I guess it's true. It's a little embarrassing almost to say that loneliness is central to your life, but I realized that when I created the character of Michael Tolliver, all of those characters, all of those people who live at 28 Barbary Lane are feeling alone and wanting to link up with someone and not knowing how to do it. And sometimes mistaking sex for love. And so I built all of this in from what I myself was doing. I was having a grand time catching up with my sexuality. Gay men who don't come out of the closet, who don't act. I didn't go to bed with anybody until I was 25 years old. So I had a lot of
catching up.
A lot of catching up. And therefore you go through your adolescence, when you're 30, in terms of the ways in which you make yourself ridiculous. And I did a lot of that. And that's perfect. It's useful in a humorous context. But yes, I knew the minute that I figured out that this is what I was going to be and who I wanted to be, that I wanted someone else to go through life with. I knew that. I didn't know how to look for it in any sound kind of way, and I made a couple of mistakes along the way. I found the love of my life when I was 60 years old. So
Chris is here, so...
Huh? He said, yeah, where is he? It's time to embarrass him.
Back. Hey!
And yes, aren't I lucky? I think we're all on that search. I think that's one of the appeals of Tales of the City, that there's people feel sympathy for all of those characters because there's something themselves in it.
Yeah, but also I think that the extraordinary thing about your work and potentially, and you speak about this in your interviews, is also how love introduced you to loneliness. It's a different kind of way of being, when with what happened with your first partner and how you went off to New Zealand. I don't know if that's something that you can...
What? Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, when when you left San Francisco and decided you were going to move away and live in solitude while he was sick.
Oh yes, well my first partner was HIV positive, and in those days that was a death sentence.
Yeah.
So we bought a farmhouse in New Zealand, where I was on a book tour. New Zealand is the last place in the Western world they send you on a book tour.
Right.
And at the time, before Lord of the Rings, the prices were amazing. You could buy the most charming little place in the country for nothing. And but best laid plans. You think somebody's going to die, and then they don't, and then they decide they'd much rather be with somebody other than you now that they're not going to die, which is roughly what happened.
And you wrote about
I think the terror of that on both of us was such that it didn't allow for a real clear vision of the relationship. So we did move to this little place. I sold it to my sister, and she ran it as a bed and breakfast for about 15 years, so it's been very much in the family.
Your biological and logical family.
Yeah, my sister's biological.
The other thing that I took away from the book, which if you can open up a little bit, was the themes of freedom and sexual freedom in particular, was that you were really crafting the language for people to inhabit unspecified states of being sexual, different ways of inhabiting relationships. What was that whole process like?
I'm sorry.
Writing about, at the time when it was so fresh and nascent and people didn't identify or didn't know how to identify. And
they knew. I mean, there were lots of LGBT people out there. The shock for them was to read it in the morning newspaper. and to see it validated in that way. I mean, I don't think they ran off and said, "Oh, this is what I want to be." They were there already. Funny story about how the column sometimes outed people inadvertently.
Did you break a few marriages?
And I don't think it. Well, I don't think it broke up any marriages, but it did. There's this one man that I knew who's a very butch thing, and he was apparently completely in the closet at work. And all his coworkers knew that he went roller skating every Tuesday night. And it wasn't until they read an episode of Tales of the City that they learned that that was gay night at the roller skating rink. So it was all, even something as tame as that, was rather scandalous in terms of the sunlight that it shed on life itself. So that I was really happy about that. I liked that process.
Yeah, but that's why I found the books were so important, because they were really mirrors to people's lives, and they allowed you to examine your own being. Which is kind of different, because now, you have social media, you have the internet and so forth. But, sorry, I'm being asked to turn around and scare people away. I will do that. Actually, we decided that we were just going to have a very quiet, gentle conversation, which is why I was sitting across. But if you ask me to, I will turn around. The relationship that you explore in the books kind of played out in so many people's lives. The other aspect that I found very important in your books was the role and nature of friendship, because these were all people who had been strewn across from different pockets of America and came into San Francisco and had to think about actually constructing families, constructing their own private tribes. Was that also something that you did when you came in?
Constructing the family? It happened naturally. It was just an organic process, and like all families, there were a few rotten apples. I mean, you don't pick all the right people right away, but my life has evolved in the most beautiful way, where actually some of the friendships are actually, one of my deepest friendships is with Laura Linney, the actress who played my character, Mary Ann Singleton, in the miniseries that was based on the books. Laura had a baby last year, and its
middle name is Armistead.
The baby's middle name is Armistead, and which is the most loveliest gift you could give your gay friend, a baby with no effort at all. I was actually in the dentist chair in Santa Fe, like flat on my back, when she called from the delivery room. And told me, and it was pretty thrilling. So friendship, actually, in a broader sense, not just my work, but the degree to which I have called on friends to be out or hope to inspire them to be out, has made a big difference. Sir Ian McKellen is someone I've known for 32 years. I met him first when he was, to me, just a British stage actor who came through San Francisco, and he asked me one night if I thought he should be out of the closet, and I gave him my usual little pep talk, and then he came out and received his knighthood the following year.
Wow.
I thought, well, maybe he has destroyed any possibility of further recognition, and we're very, very dear friends to this day, and I think it's that logical family thing, because we feel connected to each other in that way. I've always argued that when you're a gay person, and even to a more fine degree, a gay person in the literary world, you can claim a genealogy. The writer Christopher Isherwood sort of took me under his wing back in the late 70s. Actually, I went to his house and looked him up, and then he and his partner Don invited me back, and we became a family. Don, who is 81 today, and then Chris and I, my Chris, not Isherwood, are still very close. And Isherwood was friends with Forster. I mean, Forster helped him And you can take it back to Edward Carpenter. You can go through this string of writers who shared this thing of having, probably suffered to some degree or another over who they knew themselves to be, but then built art out of it. There was a lovely man named Sam Stewart who was a lesser writer. He was best known. There's a biography just written of him called Secret Historian, because he kept records of his sexual escapades. He had something he called a stud file, and he had Rudolph Valentino and Rock Hudson, and then sailors and longshoremen. He just had a whole card file of it. And recently there's a very amusing book written about it. And I went to a book signing he had back in the early 80s when he was writing a series of detective novels in which Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas were the detectives. It's a pretty great idea, really. And he recognized my name when I gave it to him and my work, and he inscribed in my book for Armistead Maupin a very successful tiller in our field, or something to that effect. And then he said, "And in bed, wow."
Oh, well, I hope you had that framed.
He was my age at the time, if not older, and I was pretty sure I'd never been to bed with him. And I said, "This is very sweet, but what do you mean?" And he said, "Oh, don't worry about that, but one day you'll be able to say to people that you've slept with the man who slept with the man who slept with Oscar Wilde." Because when he was young, he had sought out the aging Lord Alfred Douglas, Bosie, and could make that claim himself. So that's gay genealogy.
When you were speaking of this and friendship, what came to mind was this beautiful quote by Andrew Sullivan, who talks about friendship being the performance art of love. And that's something that stayed with me, that it's actually a very, very beautiful, because he talks about it in his book, and the role of friendship for gay men during the AIDS epidemic, because that's all they really had. And is that something that you witnessed and saw again?
Oh, of course. I mean, there were a number of things about relationships, love relationships, that were revealed by the AIDS epidemic. A big one, was that the women were right there for us. They stepped forward and they were caregivers and supporters and fish shakers, and, they were there for us. They were there for us in a way that I'm ashamed to say gay men have never marched out en masse about breast cancer or any of the things that women have to deal with. But they were there. And I think that's when, interestingly, that's when we we solidified as a political entity. Because AIDS not only demolished the closet in many instances, there was no more hiding it. That was the case with Rock Hudson. It demolished the closet, but it made us aware of the strength of our relationships. And by the time people were dying in each other's arms, we knew that we had families. We knew that we had husbands. The notion that we weren't ready for marriage is preposterous, because that love, that bond of love, was functioning without the benefit of, without the blessing of society at all. We didn't have that famous piece of paper, but we had the thing that mattered, that got us through.
White talks about this in her book, where she says that what AIDS did was make gay people visible. And she said, unfortunately, an entire generation of men had to die to be seen alive to begin with. And I think that was really profound, because when you speak about it in your book, it's done with a certain lightness of touch, apropos, say, Edmund White, who decides that, okay, this is going to be loss within loss, it's going to be very heavy, we're going to treat it like the classical tragic form, and that's how it's going to be. But you discussed it as you've discussed everything else. This is just life, deal with it. How are you going to live? How are you going to die? What do you owe the people you love? Yes,
it's that simple. We've only got so much time on the planet. And we must deal with who we are and who we love and get on with it joyfully. I don't understand. I must admit, I don't understand the closet. I really don't. It's self-interest in the end to own yourself. And if people that you think love you don't love you after that, then you've had a really handy way to sort out the bastards from the nice guys.
That's true. That's true. So while we're in the subject of friendship, and before we break into the questions, I was thinking, should we talk a little about the friends that have influenced your life and your work? You were talking a little earlier on about Ian McKellen. What is that friendship like?
Oh, knowing Ian McKellen, as anyone who knows him will tell you, is just the loveliest thing in the world. He's an extremely generous, funny, self-effacing man. He takes that Gandalf sword all over England and knights little children who've been bullied, you know. He's a rare man, and I treasure the time I get with him. I usually, you know, we live a world apart, but I saw him most recently, Chris and I did, in San Francisco when he came through for a promotional tour around Mr. Holmes, and it's always, he has a gift for making you feel like the only friend he has. You know it's not true, but you feel it when you're with him. Lovely guy, and a most dedicated activist I've ever met.
And his life is his activism, right?
His life is his activism. Yeah. I was telling a story about him to his face, and he says, "Oh no, I didn't do that." I said, "I think you did," but he gets even Tories, you know, come up to him and want his autograph. You know, people that get up and say terrible things about gay people want Ian McKellen's autograph. So maybe he didn't write, "Fuck you, Ian McKellen," on that piece of paper that was handed him by the Tory. But essentially, he wouldn't do that. He says he wouldn't do that because he is kind of a gentleman, but he speaks out. And if there's a moment where he can do some good, he will do it.
You know, what's also extraordinary about both your visit and Stephen Fry's visit is that you all have come to India with your husbands, and how lightly and how, you know, profoundly you wear that role, particularly in a country where, you know, you have outdated, irrelevant, hurtful, inhumane, terrible laws like Section 377. So I think that, you know, your visit is important both from a literary perspective, but just the fact that you're here and you're talking about and celebrating love in its many avatars is going to be something, because just imagine the number of young people here in Jaipur who are going to hear you talk about love and how it illuminates your life, and there's your handsome husband sitting at the third or fourth last row. And it's going to think, you know, this is permission. This is what we were talking about, the dowry of language, you know, that you can actually initiate somebody and pass on freedoms, that you can actually turn around and say, look, this is what I lived through, and this is a language that allows you to live your life.
You know, I must say, I felt terribly honored when the invitation came from the festival, because I realized that there was a significance to that. That Mr. Dalrymple of the festival said, "There will be dancing girls and boys, so you should come join us." I mean, we knew that it would, I mean, I don't know, there are plenty of queer people who've come to this festivals in one form or another, so we're not the only ones, but we felt it. I mean, I felt the impact of that. Stephen and his husband and Chris and I are in the same hotel, and we bump into each other in the hallways. It is like a Noel Coward comedy for the 21st century. And I look at that as my function now in my senior years, just to make myself Exhibit A for a happy life lived out of the closet.
How wonderful. I wanted to go back to friends that we were speaking of, and Isherwood. What did you learn from him?
Isherwood told me one time, I think because he realized that I was sensitive on the subject, remember, dear boy, it's possible to commit art and entertainment at the same time. And I worried because my instinct is so much to entertain that it might be perceived not as art, because I work very hard to polish what I do. I mean, I see it as a special thing. It's not something I'm rattling off. I've only written 11 novels in 40 years. He told me that, and I think the example, that's where I learned that a life lived openly just, it takes away the ability of other people to hurt you or to control you. They lived in Hollywood, in one of the most closeted places on the planet, and they had these parties at their house, and all of Hollywood showed up and saw these two men. They had a generation difference too, by the way, of 30 years, who were not embarrassed about who they were, and it was a giant lesson in and of itself. You didn't have to say anything. You didn't have to get all preachy and angry and political. You just show people what love looks like. And he did that for me. It's still, to this day, I find things, as you know, he wrote massive diaries. And lately I've been reading the ones that he's wrote when he was the age I am now, and I think, oh, that's me. I have senile resentment. He talks about his senile resentments. He's always telling himself not to be grumpy. Yeah, it was the example of a life well lived. He wasn't perfect at all, but he had a sense of humor about himself, and he was far more disciplined than I've ever been, but he had all the same self-doubts. I think that's always useful to read when other writers thinks that their work is shit, and yet the world says otherwise, you know.
And I thought we should talk a little about Amy, because she's so special. So while you're drinking water, I'm going to tell you a story that she and I are talking, but this is completely confidential. It's just between us and...
Okay.
So we've been exchanging messages about Armistead's visit, and she said, you know, Siddharth, I have a great discovery. And I said, what is this? And so she said, you know, all the women my age in San Francisco are using Botox, but I've discovered that you can actually use anorectal cream on your face, and your face will freeze. So, so I said, okay, like, how does it work? So she said, you know, it's basically, you put it under your eye, and she said, you know, I can't move a muscle. She said, I look like a Chinese Cher. So this is my Amy Tan story, but you have obviously a better one.
She'd kill me if I said something like that about her. No, all of my stories are, I don't know her beauty secrets. She must have a few, because she looks really great. And now, of course, she's dyeing her hair lavender, which is quite beautiful.
But tell us about the wedding, because she hosted that.
The wedding, it was lovely. It was very simple. I'll tell you what I remember most about Amy was when she took me in. I was in my editor of one of my novels died in 2001. And there was a memorial service for him on the day before 9/11. And I flew there and was in my hotel room when the planes hit the buildings a few blocks away. And Amy was in town at the time, and she just took me under her wing and was, you know, so easy. She had, medical issues of her own that she was dealing with at the time, but she was just so generous, and there's a really strong motherly instinct in her. I've known 3 or 4 women in San Francisco who've died after difficult illnesses, and Amy has been there by their bedside. She's just a remarkably generous person, and as you know, a very dry wit. There's a lot about her to love.
Well, we're going to open up the...
And she's from Sacramento. That's what I'm always fond of saying. I said, I knew you before you were Chinese.
Okay, so we're going to open up this conversation with all of us. So if there's a question, there's a lady over there in the black who has a question.
Thank you very much. I just want to correct something that you said earlier. You said that you didn't think that gay men had done very much for women, but that women were there for you. I just want to say that actually it's because of the activism of gay men in California, in the US, and in South Africa that actually antiretrovirals became affordable and accessible to people with HIV in Africa. It was because people like you and others stood up and demanded that the drug companies reduce the cost of ARVs, and that there were some gay men who actually refused to have treatment themselves until it became available for everyone. So I think you should take some of the credit for that. And the fact that in the place where I live, 80% of pregnant women and other women with HIV now have antiretrovirals. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and I think there was this kind of implicit bias in what I said when I think about it, as if women were somehow unaffected by HIV. So yes, that battle helped everyone, and I'm glad we could give something to our sisters.
I saw a hand at the back over there. Yes, sir.
Hi. To what extent do you wish to be read as a gay writer? And do you consider yourself a gay writer? And I mention this in the context of the irony of whenever I open my Netflix, I see a whole sort of section on LGBT movies, and I go to the bookstore and I see a whole section on LGBT fiction, as if that was its own sort of subculture, and whether it needs to be its own subculture.
Thank you for that question. I've struggled with that my entire career because I've been an activist and openly gay longer than a lot of people, and proud of that. And I'm proud of the fact that I have included gay stories in my work. But I don't, the concept of a gay novel, what is that? Is that a novel that only has sex with novels of the same sex? We get mired in academia where everything gets stuck into little categories of queer theory and this or that. And I'm writing human stories, and I'm happy that that they have power for everyone. I'm writing about everyone and for everyone. And I sort of resent it when, usually for marketing reasons, the Netflix version of Tales of the City gets stuck into the gay category. There's 2 characters out of the 8 major characters that are gay. So this stems directly from the fact that it was so radical to include any gay characters at all in your fiction that it overwhelms the whole in a way. I deal with it. I don't think I'm a gay writer. I think I'm a gay man. The distinction is a fine one, but you don't want to be stuck into the category. I've talked to Amy about this. Amy gets stuck on Asian bookshelves, and when in fact she's one of the most universally loved writers anywhere. But if you aren't white and male and straight, you get your own little section in the back of the bus, And so I think that's changing gradually, but it has been a problem. In the beginning, I didn't want to, it bothered me that the new gay fiction that was coming out was always signaled because they had a shirtless man on the front cover. And it wasn't really about that at all, but they were trying, the publishers were trying to find a market. When I started out at HarperCollins, which was Harper and Row back in 1978, my editor didn't want to put the word gay in the description of the characters in the beginning of the books. He said.
So what did she put?
It was a he, and he was in the closet, by the way. No, you barely knew what the book was about. It had a map of San Francisco on the cover, and it ended up in the travel section at a lot of bookstores. But then it didn't take them long to figure out it was a market, and then they were suddenly, we've got to get some gay books too. And I think that's been a struggle. I think that's difficult for all writers. Was. I don't think so much anymore.
There's a question right here, sir.
Thank you, yes. After resisting being called a gay writer, I think it's certainly true that you are perhaps the world's foremost commentator on LGBT communities, and certainly gay communities. And in the United States and elsewhere, there's been a change in technology, changes in social attitudes, changes in the legal situation, and these communities are undergoing change. And I wonder if you might want to comment on the change and perhaps say something that you see positive about it, perhaps something that you see that could be better.
It's tough to talk about the way things were and the way they are now because you want to keep out that, what Isha would call senile resentments thing. You don't know whether what you're longing for is your own youth or an earlier time. Obviously, the information explosion, Scruff, Grindr, the fact that you can, make your next date on your phone has changed things radically. I think it still comes down to two people having to eventually talk to each other and have sex or whatever the pickup is. I don't know. I don't have any big general words of wisdom about how things have changed culturally. Gay activism is a very suit and tie thing now, and it's just part of the establishment. And when the HRC says it's endorsing Hillary Clinton,
Conveniently.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't even want to get into the politics of that, and I may end up voting for Hillary Clinton. I don't know, but it's not. It's a far cry from when we were all standing in a room and putting this thing together on our own. And I think that a certain fervor and joy and dedication is missing. But my generation is sort of responsible for that because they brought us to where we are now. So we should celebrate the fact that the world has changed as much as it has. I try to do that. Sorry, that's a rather vague answer. I don't have a lot of wisdom about it.
Question? Sorry.
I have, a few questions. So I'm just going to start with the first
Start with one?
All right, yeah, yeah.
She warned us.
I'll race through it. So the first one that I want to ask is, how hard was it? Because now that you're in a position where if you look back, it's better in retrospective, right? Because you are in a position where you have acknowledged the fact that this is your identity. But for a lot of people in India, it's not as easy to acknowledge the fact that, okay, whatever comes with it, I will deal with it. So that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is that in India, another problem that we have is that we don't acknowledge sexuality at all. It's not about you being homosexual at all. Like, once you're 18, 19, you don't get to acknowledge your sexuality. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think it must be harder in India if it's true that 80% of the population are in marriages that are arranged. Then that makes the predicament of the average heterosexual not that much different from a homosexual who's also told, the fact that you are not allowed to choose the object of your love.
Although that's changing a lot.
Yes, I know, rapidly.
Rapidly.
And the younger generation is proving that to be the case. I'm not an expert here. I'm just mouthing what I hear from people, what I've heard from people in the last week, really. It's always hard at the beginning, and then it's very joyful. And I think it really has to do, everybody's situation is different, but if you're worried about losing love, then you're going to really have to redefine it. You're going to have to create a family for yourself that supports you. So, and that way, you don't have to be angry or scornful of your biological family, not believing, fine, believe what you want to believe, but this is my life, and this is where I'm going to find love, and how I'm going to do it. And you have to decide how important that is to you. And I think that that opening up of the heart in a true way makes you into a better artist, a better person, a kinder, more tolerant person. There's all sorts of beautiful side effects that come from it if and when you're able to do it. And you kind of know when the moment comes. I was 32 years old before I did, fully. I had a whole city supporting me for a while before I worked up the nerve. And I actually came out to my family in a letter that I wrote in Tales of the City. That's how they found out. I didn't directly go to them because I wanted to get the words exactly right. And I ended up reading it on stage at the Castro Theater in San Francisco at a big gay rights benefit. And I felt at that moment I had made the leap into my real life, into my youth. I felt younger than I had for years. When you're in the closet and you carry the weight of that secret for so long, and you're in the process of deceiving the very people you love, your family, it's damaging. So
you had a question?
Yeah, first off, thank you both for such a fantastic conversation today. My question may not be fair to a man who's written 11 novels and countless columns, but I'm hoping it will resonate with the storyteller in you. Can you choose a favorite tale or one that particularly resonates with you out of all you've written and share it with us?
out of all my own?
Yeah.
I suppose that coming out letter, which is in More Tales of the City, is the one that has resonated most in my own life. I've heard from thousands of people that they've used it as a template for their own coming out. It's been set to music 3 different times. And so I think it's probably the thing that will last longest that I've created, so I love it for that reason. I'm especially proud of the novel, The Night Listener, which is not related to tales, but it's a sort of, I call it a thriller of the heart. It's a sort of mystery story, but on a very personal level. That's probably what I would pick out. And I love the Significant Others, which is a novel that's set in the woods in Northern California and involves the collision between a women's music festival, a lesbian music festival, and a very conservative men's club. It's sort of my Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's one of the few things that I've written that has a sort of unity of time and place. And I'm very proud of the way that one unfolds, the way the mechanics of it work.
Sorry, we'll take one last question because I know you have to. We have to break.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed your work since you did your daily Tales of the City and the Chronicle. In essence, I see
No, can you just hold? Yeah.
Oh, is it all right now?
Yes,
okay.
perfect.
I'm sorry. In your Chronicles of San Francisco, it's in a sense a social history of the city. And I'm wondering today what your characters would think of San Francisco today. The San Francisco of Google buses, the San Francisco of luxury condominiums, the San Francisco of young billionaires all over the place. Do they have a part in this city still, your characters?
Well, the last book in the series, Anna Madrigal, The Days of Anna Madrigal, was just written 2 years ago, so that conflict is reflected in that book to a certain degree. There's a homeless woman in it. This is the question. We live with this all the time, Christopher and I. I mean, we have rented a place at a ridiculously exorbitant cost just to be there in the city. We see these people, and some of them are very nice. We have young techies living upstairs from us. They have to live, 4 to a flat because it's too expensive for them too. So I can't get too grumpy about it because the world always changes. We've had robber barons come to town before. We'll probably have them come again. It saddens me that artists have to leave. That's the toughest part. And we may be forced out eventually if the people just get so boring around us that we have no reason to stay there anymore. But I don't see it. There's still a bohemian life there. I think that's what attracts these tech people. Their companies are, down there on Market Street. But people still love San Francisco for the same reasons they always did. So it's a mixed bag.
And thank you for making people love San Francisco. You were such an integral part.
May I take a picture of the audience?
Yeah.
Don't worry, this won't appear on the cover of a newspaper and incriminate you.
You can have your Ellen moment. My Ellen moment. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Take a selfie. How do I do that? Forget it. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Armistead Maupin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Armistead Maupin and Siddharth Dhanvant Shanghvi, for this session, Tales of the City, presented by DNA. Please, ladies and gentlemen, when you leave the venue, take your belongings and also take the litter with you. Don't leave anything behind. And those coming in, maybe they can first of all let the other people go out before coming in, so that we have like a quick turnover. Thank you. The authors will be available for book signing outside. The book signing table is outside on the left-hand side. So if you want to get your books signed, they will be there for you.